Our final presenter will be Catherine Downie. She is the head of data quality assurance of M&E at Worldvision, and she'll be talking about building resilience to mitigate effects of future shocks in agriculture in the Somaliland, in Somalia, actually. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to start the presentation with some results of a study that we've done, which will then lead into how we are using those results to help with formulation of our strategy for phase 2 of our project. Just to give you a brief background, SOMREP is a consortium of 7 NGOs that has a large livelihoods program in Somalia. We have 4 donors: CEDA, EU ECHO, SDC, DFAT, and USAID on and off, so 5. And we have been going since 2013. Phase 1 is finishing this year, and phase 2, which we currently have funding for in bits, will continue till about 2023. So far, we will have spent for phase 1 around $80 million, and we are looking at about half that amount to continue going, and we will get money as it comes, which is generally the way. So what I'm going to start with is we did a study which looked at anecdotally identified positive deviants. So those households that were doing better than others, which were identified by beneficiaries themselves and also our program managers on the ground, and also other participants. So we wanted to look at what were the characteristics of these households, because if we're able to identify the characteristics, perhaps we can use that as a proxy for resilience as well. So these are the areas that we did the positive deviant study. So you can see it's a reasonable breadth of Southwest State, which is Dolo, Juba, Jubaland, Luke, and then we have Eel, which is in Puntland, and we have Badan and Erigavo, which span Puntland, Somaliland, and then we have Odwain in Somaliland. So it was a fairly comprehensive look at the entire country. We did a qualitative round first to talk through what a positive deviance household was, and also to help identify those further. We then wanted to look at backing up this identification with quantitative, and so we did a quantitative survey. We used both computer-assisted and face-to-face as well. Now, the qualitative findings, basically, we were interested in looking at the role of savings groups and what people use them for, because that seemed to be a commonality amongst all the participants. The most compelling quantitative finding was that the characteristics most closely associated with those people who were identified as having better food security and better capacity to cope were belonging to a savings group scheme and having access to early warning, early action information. So we also managed to find out a few other results as well, which were, as you can see on the slide, I won't bother going through, but they were associated with the more activities they participated in, the better off the households were. Now, just in terms of the findings of belonging to a VSLA, so that's a Village Savings and Loans Group, or having access to early warning, early action information, we are going to continue to do further rounds of data collection for this study, both in the what we would call the dry or lean season, but also in the harvest season to incorporate seasonality, because we want to try and collect panel data sets. And one of the things we're interested in looking at is whether or not belonging to a savings group scheme is important because of the function of the savings group scheme, in other words, access to informal financial instruments, or whether actually it's the function of belonging to a network that may actually have the positive effect. And the same thing holds true for early warning, early action information, because what we don't know so far is have they actually used that information to implement strategies to mitigate the effects of drought. So those are a couple of things that we wanted to explore a bit further. So, sorry, this has now stopped working. There we are. There. As I mentioned, a couple of other findings from the quantitative study. One thing I should mention as well is we use the impact outcome indicators of food consumption scores, a score on the household hunger scale, and also for coping ability, reduced negative coping strategies on the RCSI. These are not very good indicators, in my opinion, in the sense that they don't manifest change at the scale that perhaps we're interested in looking at. So I am interested in exploring different types of indicators, and I would love to collaborate with somebody else who has to do the same type of analysis. Continuing on, you can actually, one of the things that was compelling was obviously the higher level of education for the female head of household, or at the level of a spouse head of household. And these are all the things that we want to explore further in further data collection rounds. Now, one of the reasons we did this study was to validate our approach, was to see whether or not what we were doing was having its intended effect. And so we actually received validation that one of the more important things we could do was to start off with that pathway of belonging to a mechanism which allowed access to informal financial instruments. And so we were gratified to see that that happened. And so, as I mentioned, now I'm sorry this is a bit difficult to read, but this is basically our theory of change, which looks at building development plans with the community, then moving on to looking at informal financial instruments as safety nets, and then moving on further to looking at diversification of livelihood strategies, natural resource management, and eventually moving into the second phase, which now hopefully is going to be much more focused on agricultural livelihoods. So as I was mentioning this morning, we want to move into much more into looking at economic growth strategies through agriculture. But this is extremely difficult because we don't have sort of much support in terms of donor engagement to actually put this into practice, largely because Somalia is still categorized as in need of humanitarian assistance rather than development assistance. So this is one thing that we have to work on. Our strategy for doing this is very much, this is our theory of change for agricultural transformation. And the idea is that with the money that you receive for cash for work in an emergency situation, you then invest part of that in a village savings and loan. When you accumulate enough eventually, and when your community accumulates enough, you then move into formal financial instruments. And that opens up your lines of credit, etc. Also, these groups that have been formed at the levels of VSLAs hopefully will transition into cooperatives and organization and sort of a collective risk mitigation group that will allow particularly women, and particularly will come up with opportunities for youth along the different value chains that are built around agricultural crops, etc. At the same time, you're going to the government, you're going to help them work on strategies to improve the environment, to make an enabling regulatory environmental framework, And I will move on to the next slide, which really looks at employing a push-pull for inclusive market growth. And so you're looking at building the capacities of smallholder farmers to become competitive. So in other words, to compete in marketplaces which they might otherwise not be able to. At the same time, you're trying to work with government, private sector, et cetera, to create an enabling environment and expand the diversity and quality of opportunities. And particularly we're paying attention to women's economic empowerment and youth employment. So that's the philosophy behind it. And these are some of the push strategies. So you seek to build the assets, you build their market readiness, you improve their negotiating, you create basically less risky points for households to enter the marketplace. And on the pull side, you seek to lower the barriers for market entry and also to really look at building the middle section of the value chain, because that's very much where the tertiary employment in the agricultural sector creates opportunities. And very much this is where hopefully you engage the private sector. So these are the key features: systems approach, market demand driven, using sequencing, phasing, and layering. So you're basically trying to involve all sections of the value chain. And it requires a very good knowledge management system, which helps you based on the evidence base that you create, informs your strategic direction. So you've got to have good data collection, you've got to have unique IDs for the beneficiaries or cooperative groups, etc., which is something NGOs don't invest in very well, but we're trying to. And these are some of the interventions that would be on both sides of this push-pull strategy. Some of the challenges that we come up against are some that I already mentioned, but one of the big ones I found is that there isn't the technical capacity within the NGOs, and I was very gratified to see Cordaid's example on one of the slides of doing all of the work that we actually intend to do. So I'm going to talk to them about how we get that, because one of the big problems that we have is I'm an agricultural scientist by trade, and I come from the CGIAR system. I have worked with a lot of the different scientists in creating agricultural technologies, and I know of at least 10 that are on the shelf, for example, ready to be put into practice. I talked to one of my friends who's a seed breeder. He does some beautiful drought-tolerant, climate-smart seeds and legumes. We tried to put them into practice in Somalia, and we actually didn't even have the capacity to do good demo plots. So this sort of bridging of the gap, and this is what this slide is about, is bridging the gap between smallholders and agricultural technologies. We really have to look at ways for people to enter that space to broker. Because having worked with scientists, being a scientist myself, you don't come into contact with services, with organizations, with agencies that can help you realize the impact of your creation. You don't often get an opportunity to test and trial, to look at will it go to scale. I mean, we're not going to have another green revolution where, we're going to have impact achieved through scale, through uptake and adoption of a variety of technologies. And I think that we need to find that sort of mechanism that brings these two bodies of people together. So that's something I'd be very interested in talking about to donors and also to agencies, because I really feel that it's a space where the management of science, the brokering, the bringing together in partnerships is something that we could all work on together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for sharing with us, the outcomes of your study and challenges that you have gone through. I mean, especially, I think the last point you brought out in terms of extending some of the technologies that are available in a crisis situation, because I think it came up earlier that agricultural development tends to focus a lot more on stable environments and not always in fragile situations. So I think That's quite critical. And if I remember, I think many years ago, the CGR had a whole program for fragile states, especially supplying improved seeds and so on. So I don't know if that's still active. Unfortunately, it may not be still. It may not be active anymore. But obviously, all these interventions, I think, they have to come together also in these crisis situations.